Antonio Villas Boas was the son of Geronimo Villas Boas and Anacia Candida de Oliveira, farmers in São Francisco de Sales, Minas Gerais. To tillage the land, the Villas Boas family used a tractor with which they worked in 2 shifts, one day and one night. During the day the farm workers worked, and at night Antonio himself, alone or accompanied by his brothers and brothers-in-law. On October 5, 1957 the Villas Boas received visits, which is why everyone went to bed only around 11 p.m. Antonio opened a window of his room, which opened onto a garden. He was in the company of Brother John. Suddenly he saw a light of indefinite procedure, much clearer than a moonlight, illuminating the whole environment. He called his brother, who was not interested in the phenomenon. Antonio soon closed a window and they both went to sleep. Shortly after, without resisting curiosity, Antonio made a stand and a window opened. A continuous light unchanged, but suddenly she moved to the window. Frightened, Antonio closed the window, woke his brother and, in a dark room, both came to accompany a light that came through the shutters. The light shifted to the top of the roof of the house, where it penetrated through the cracks between like tiles. Finally, after a few minutes, a light disappeared and did not return. On October 14 there was a second incident that occurred around 9:30 or 22 hours. At that time, Antonio worked with the company of another brother, Jose, probably. Suddenly they saw a clear, penetrating light, a point of doing as their sights. The light was large and round, like a cartwheel, and it was at the northern end of the field. It was a clear light and illuminated a large area. When they looked at it better, they could see something in the light, but they could not tell what it was, for their sight was totally obfuscated. Curious, Antonio began to run after the light, which in turn began to run away from him. Finally he gave up the job and went back to his brother. For a few minutes, a light stayed still, the distance, she seemed to be flashing in all directions. Then he disappeared so suddenly that he gave the impression of simply erasing. In the dawn of October 16, 1957, Antonio was plowing the land alone with the tractor when he was surprised by a red light. The light approached, progressively increasing in size. It was an oval and shiny object, which remained static about 50 meters from the farmer's head, hovering. Antonio was paralyzed with fear. After about 2 minutes, the object went down and landed some 15 meters away from the farmer. It was when he could clearly distinguish the contours of the machine. It looked like an elongated egg, with 3 metal peaks, with a thin point and a wide base, arranged side by side. On top of the ship something spun at high speed and emitted a fluorescent red light. Suddenly, the underside of the object opened and let out 3 metal supports. Antonio concluded that it was the ship's landing gear. Realizing that something imminent would happen to him, he decided to flee the tractor, but after moving a few meters with the vehicle, the engine stopped and the headlights went out. He tried to start, but the engine did not stop. Antonio jumped from the tractor and started to run, but a being who barely reached the height of his shoulders grabbed his arm. In desperation, Antony struck him with a blow that made him lose his balance, drop his arm and fall backwards. Again he tried to run, when 3 other beings instantly grabbed him by the arms and legs and lifted him from the ground. Although overpowered, Antonio offered resistance, but the aliens finally managed to make him climb a pliable, swinging ladder into the ship's interior. In the UFO, Antonio was completely undressed, despite his opposing efforts. An oily liquid, but that did not leave the skin greasy, was passed in his body with a kind of sponge. In another room, two beings approached with a kind of chalice, from which came two flexible hoses. They put the end of one of the tubes in the chalice, the other end had a mouthpiece like a suction cup, which they threaded into the jaws of Villas Boas. The farmer felt no pain, only the feeling that the skin was being sucked. His blood flowed down the tube and settled into the chalice, which filled up to half. The tube was then withdrawn. The other tube, which had not yet been used, was placed on the other side of the chin, from which more blood was collected, until the vessel was complete. Antonio's skin burned and itched instead of the bleeding. Left alone in a room that exuded a smoke of unpleasant and suffocating smell, which caused him vomits, Antonio waited for a long time until, to his astonishment, a woman completely naked appeared. Her hair was soft and blonde, almost platinum as if white, and fell on the back of her neck, her tips turned inward. Her hair was parted in half, and she had large, almond-shaped blue eyes. According to Antonio, the alien was low, but beautiful. What struck her most was the fact that she had red armpits and pubic hair. This alien approached Antonio in silence, leaving no doubt about his intentions. She hugged Antonio and began rubbing her face and body against his. The door closed and Antonio was alone with the alien, with whom he ended up having several sexual relations. Finally, pretending to be tired, the alien began to reject Antonio. Before leaving the room, she turned to him and pointed first at her belly, then with a kind of smile, at Antony himself, and finally at the top as if to say that he was going to be father of a being born among the stars. Soon after, one of the aliens returned with Antonio's clothes, which he dressed immediately. According to Antonio, the aliens wore tight overalls, a very thick, gray fabric, very soft and, in some places, glued with black stripes. Covering their head and neck, they wore a helmet of the same color, but of more consistent and reinforced material behind, with narrow strips of metal. This helmet covered the whole head, exposing only the eyes, protected by a pair of round glasses. Antonio was then taken off the ship. Before, he even tried to get an object to prove the story, but the aliens realized it and took the object back. Finally, the ship took off vertically and disappeared in a few minutes. Antonio calculated that he stayed inside the UFO from 1:15 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. in the morning, hence more than 4 hours. Of the abduction of Antonio Villas Boas. At the time, no photographs were taken of the marks the landing gear of the spacecraft would have left. In 1978, the Villas Boas family farm suffered a flood, destroying all evidence of that. It is also against Antonio's testimony that his story was divulged by the journalist João Martins, of O Cruzeiro magazine, who was the protagonist of another UFO case, the Barra de Tijuca case. There are few proofs too, which was evidently a fraud. The greatest evidence of the Villas Boas case is the marks that Antonio presented in the body, which would have been caused by the experiments that the extraterrestrials would have done with him, and the symptoms that he suffered, similar to that of someone who had been exposed to a radiation moderate. But when Antonio died on January 17, 1991, at age 56, the death certificate issued by the Civil Registry Office of Uberaba, Minas Gerais, indicated as a cause mortis subarachnoid hemorrhage, basilar artery aneurysm and arterial hypertension.